Good day to everybody, and thank you for being here. This hearing will now come to order. We meet to probe the ever-deteriorating state of civil and political rights in Hong Kong on the eve of House passage of my bipartisan legislation, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019, exactly 2 years ago tomorrow. We also meet in search of pursuing the most effective ways to mitigate and end the egregious crimes committed against Hong Kongers each and every day by the Chinese Communist Party. And we meet to remind the brave democracy activists that we deeply respect their courage and sacrifice, and that they are absolutely not forgotten. 70 years ago, I first introduced the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2014. It was the time of the umbrella movement, which began in response to a decision by the Standing Committee of the PRC's National People's Congress to pre-screen candidates for Hong Kong's chief executive. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party was putting its thumb on the scale with greater force, and people were speaking out. Those were heady days with brave students like Joshua Wong and Nathan Law emerging as the next generation of democracy leaders. When looking back, one sees courageous idealism, optimism, and enthusiasm that could bring about substantive political change. At that time, it was extraordinarily hard to get my congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle, or the White House, to see the gathering threat, an existential threat, to Hong Kong democracy and human rights posed by General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. Our bill only had 5 co-sponsors that year, despite a Herculean effort to get people to sign up, but it included now Speaker Nancy Pelosi. By way of contrast, in 2019, that bill that passed the House had 47 bipartisan co-sponsors, including my friend and colleague, Jim McGovern. In 2014, far too many people in Washington felt that Hong Kong, with its greater freedom and free trade principles, would somehow tug the People's Republic of China in a liberating direction. After all, Hong Kong had the basic law, a mini constitution that could serve as a model for greater respect for the rule of law in China one day. Such hopes proved illusionary, just as some American political and business leaders naively believed that delinking trade with human rights in 1994 would somehow help the Chinese Communist Party matriculate from a brutal dictatorship to a democracy. And in like manner, there were those who thought if China, there was ascension into the WTO, they would practice the rule of law more effectively. I had 2 hearings in this room in which we countered that argument that we've got to be careful that they don't change the WTO, not the other way around. In March of 2019, as we all know, the Hong Kong government proposed extraditing alleged criminals to China, raising fears that political dissidents could be sent to mainland China to face charges over exercising their basic freedoms. Hong Kong's government and the police force began to very closely resemble that of mainland China in its response to legitimate protests, speech, and assembly. Congress, too, awakened to the changed situation. And under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, our Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was put on the docket, was put on the House floor, and it passed. It went over to the Senate, and Marco Rubio led the effort there, got his bill passed, and it all became law. Indeed, that same day, Jim McGovern's bill, placing restrictions on tear gas exports and crowd control technology to Hong Kong, also passed, with me as the lead co-sponsor on that one. Congress spoke with a unified voice. And when the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was enacted into law, the Trump administration gave it teeth, declaring that Hong Kong was no longer, quote, sufficiently autonomous, such as to warrant being treated as independent of China for trade and technological export purposes. The Trump administration also sanctioned key individuals in the Hong Kong government, including Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong chief executive. 42 PRC and Hong Kong government and police officials have been sanctioned pursuant to Trump's executive order 13936. More importantly, however, for in many ways Carrie Lam is just a figurehead and mouthpiece for the Beijing, the Trump administration sanctioned 2 individuals who are Xi Jinping's hatchet men, Chris Tang, the Secretary for Security and former head of the increasingly repressive Hong Kong police force, and John Lee, the former Secretary of Security and current Chief Secretary. Both these men, Chris Tang and John Lee, need to be better known throughout the world for the purposes of being held morally and legally accountable. They, more than anyone else, except for Xi Jinping himself, are responsible for the current demise of human rights in Hong Kong, for they have been willing executioners of the Chinese Communist Party's draconian policy. But beyond the names of those who should be called to task, are those we must remember for their valiant defense of freedom. We should remember Jimmy Lai, the brave founder of Apple Daily, that beacon of free speech shut down by the government in June of this year, his assets frozen, and his computers confiscated by the police. Jimmy is now in jail, periodically brought to court in shackles, while the court has yet to set a hearing date. People may not know this, but Jimmy is a man of deep faith, a fellow Catholic, who easily could have fled to safety, like the roughly 90,000 citizens who have left Hong Kong between June of 2020 and June of 2021, because he was a rich man. Yet Jimmy stayed in Hong Kong to stand with those who spoke for freedom. He has been stripped of his liberty, his home, traded for a jail cell, yet he stands unbroken, a testament to moral principle and defiance in the face of tyranny. One of our distinguished witnesses today, Samuel Chu, a naturalized American citizen for nearly 25 years, has been accused of violating the national security law, the draconian national security law, which severely punishes 4 types of activities: secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces, all, as Samuel says, carrying a maximum sentence of life in prison. Mr. Chu states in his testimony today that the, quote, the absence of the People's Liberation Army and rolling tanks like Tiananmen, or barbed wires and internment camps like those of Xinjiang, does not mean that the crackdown has been any less brutal, swift, and complete, close quote. Of course, there are so many others that we need to remember, less famous than Jimmy Lai and others, but they are equally heroic. Over 150 have been arrested under the national security law, and maybe more, implemented last year, and countless others have been chilled from expressing their opinion. We have seen former legislators like Claudia Mo, whom our witness Joanna Chu has highlighted in her testimony, denied bail while standing trial for practicing democracy. There are journalists who are now in jail for practicing free speech. Indeed, Hong Kong reportedly has more journalists in jail per capita than any other place on earth. We cannot forget them either, and we should say their names: Edmund Van Yeo Sing, Ryan Law, Cheong Kim Hung, Chan Pu Man, Lam Mang Chung, Fung Wei Kong, Yun Che Ni, and Gwyneth Ho are all in jail, and so many others. So many others. For those journalists watching today, hearing, or in attendance, I ask you to share their names, for freedom of the press is such an important right, undergirding so many of our other freedoms. We cannot forget these people. We cannot forget these heroic individuals. We cannot forget Hong Kong. And I sometimes believe, and I've been in Congress now 41 years, that with the crush of business and global catastrophes and challenges, COVID, somehow Hong Kong can get squeezed out of our focus, and that today has to change. We have to pivot back to standing in solidarity with the oppressed and not with the oppressor. The media in particular, again, I call on you to lift up your voices. We cannot let the tyranny of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party stifle the flame of freedom that resides in the hearts of the people of Hong Kong. I'd like to now yield. I believe he is on the line.